Welcome. I'm Harmony Slater, your host of the Finding Harmony podcast. Over the past 20 years, I've taught thousands of yoga teachers and students to explore the intersection between ancient wisdom and modern everyday life, using mind-body practices to heal, awaken, and manifest their dreams from the inside out. This podcast is a sanctuary for those feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges. Are you ready to jump in and discover how these challenges aren't actually in the way, but are the way to finding harmony? Let's invite the magic back in. Hi, welcome to the Finding Harmony podcast. I am so happy you're here today because we have just the most incredible guest joining us. He is a legend in the world of yoga and has an incredible story. His mother started teaching him or introduced him to yoga back in the 1970s. His father was also a professor of comparative religion. And so he's always sort of had this direction and this interest in the spiritual path. Doing an undergraduate under the guidance of Robert Thurman, he studied Buddhist psychology. And so has really brought in this idea of Dharma and meditation into his teaching of asana. And I'm talking about none other than T.S. Little. So I cannot wait for you to listen to this conversation. Because if you've been studying or practicing asana for any considerable time, I'm sure you've noticed that it's about much more than just the body. And the practice of yoga reveals that the physical body cannot actually be separated from the psycho-spiritual forces that animate it. What are these psycho-spiritual forces? I'm talking about prana, the life force. But it's so much more than just energy. It's energy that fuels our mental, emotional, soul, purpose, our sense of integration, our sense of connection, not only to ourselves, but to everything around us. And so T.S. Little actually has a book called Yoga of the Subtle Body, and he is offering a free training starting today for 1 week called the same thing, Yoga of the Subtle Body. And I would just invite you to join his free training because he has such wisdom and insight to share. And you really should take advantage of this opportunity to study with a teacher, a master teacher of his caliber and his level. So in this training, he's going to really look at what is this mysterious life force, this prana, and how it might touch not just your physical body, but your entire lives, and how you can develop a deeper connection with it, a union with it even. And he really integrates bringing the meditative state into the asana itself. So what is the inner asana or the inner posture? The thing that's deeper, that you're experiencing at a deeper level, not just the forms, the external forms like triangle or back bend, but how can you connect using asana, using meditation, using breath to the subtle pulsations and the rhythms of the blood and the breath and the nervous system and other fluctuating subtle body movements. So definitely jump into this training, expand your understanding of knowledge, slow down, and start to let go of some of that stress and tension that builds up in your tissues, refine your sensitivity, and connect to the inner flow of your energy and your biorhythms. Go deeper into the yoga practices themselves, into the asana. This will prepare you for developing a seated meditation and also a lifelong practice of yoga. This is everything I am about these days, exploring the subtle energies and noticing how the yoga really is about so much more than what it looks like on the outside. So I'm going to drop a link for you in the show notes here so that you can sign up for this free training. It's only available for this week. So please sign up. join the free training, learn from this master, this true teacher of yoga who's been doing the yoga practices in all forms through all types of Eastern teachings and traditions for so many years. He truly is masterful, has many books, and just been teaching for probably as long as many of you have been alive. So let's jump into this conversation with T.S. Little. It is a gift, it is a blessing, and I know it will enrich your life. Hi, welcome to the Finding Harmony podcast. I'm here today with Russell Case.
Good morning.
Hi, Russell. And we are joined with a beautiful human being.
You really got a good one today, didn't you? You got this is every once in a while we get a spectacular guest.
Yes.
This is for our generation especially. Like, this is a big deal.
Yeah. Because we're joined by T.S. Little. How are you doing?
Hello. Very good. Such a joy to join you and to be in conversation at this time. So thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, thank you for being here. It's really, truly an honor. Russell and I were talking when we were out walking the other day about how your name used to kind of float legendarily around the yoga circles we would travel in. And people saying, have you studied with T.S. Little? You really should go study with T.S. Little. And so this is a huge honor.
I can't think of a single yoga journal that didn't have your name in the book somewhere.
Well, that's true. I spent many moons in those circles, and that was such a joy because I had a chance to really parlay with all my colleagues, and times have changed, and I don't get to see like-minded yogis as much anymore.
Yeah, it's a little bit challenging now in some ways, but in some ways we're more connected and also kind of further apart.
If you call this a connection, what we're doing right now, then we're very connected.
That's right. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
It's by definition, though, isn't it? Because I feel like I'm talking to you.
Well, the same, and I think it's a sangha, that the world over, people who are, who really have an affinity for the yoga path, I think thrive off of this intermingling and interweave, and that, of course, here we are in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and our center, our retreat center, is open on occasion for in-person events, but much of what I do is, what we call in the Maha Zoom room, bouncing off the satellites into people's living rooms. But either way, I think there's that texture, that overall felt sense of connection. It really is.
I'd like to ask you, were you born in Santa Fe? I feel like you might have been born in England.
Originally, I'm from New England, so I was raised on the east coast of the U.S. But gee, I've lived in Santa Fe since 1990, which was shortly after my very first trip to Mysore, South India, studying Ashtanga Vinyasa with Patabi Joyce. And so, yeah, I've lived in the mountains of northern New Mexico 30 years.
Well, you'd mentioned once that your mother had taught you your first yoga class when I think you were like 7, but like in England. And I was wondering, how did that happen?
Well, my father was a university professor. He taught comparative religion and a lot of Eastern and Western, myth and belief. And so we were on a sabbatical in London, in 1978, and my mother was studying Iyengar yoga with a teacher named Silva Mehta. You may know
Oh, yeah.
the Iyengar.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, we
yeah,
have her book, I think, right here.
oh, you do? Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great resource. And yeah, and so my mother was really, steeped in the Iyengar method. And so that very much was my first inspiration and still is to the day. The technology of the Iyengar system is brilliant. Much of my understanding of subtle anatomy and my interest in the vayus and the chakras, very much stemmed off of that first branch of study.
What kind of boy or teenager or young man were you to want to learn yoga from your mother? I have a son. I can't even imagine him asking me to share yoga with him, even though he knows I do it all the time.
Well, I've always been really symbiotic with my mother.
Yeah.
I think, I in the yoga world now, I very much work primarily with women. Of course, it's there's a preponderance of women in the practice, and so yeah, I think that affinity enabled me to really in a profound way develop my feminine side, and so yeah, it's been this long, weave in terms of my own journey of strengthening both my masculine and my feminine. And so yeah, my mother was very much one of my first mentors, but so was my father and his interest in Eastern philosophy and in mythology and Shiva and the tales that are the underpinning of the yogic practices, which I very much relate to now, the art and the iconography and the mythology of the yoga tradition. I continue to study and go deeper and deeper in those stories.
Gosh, I think if you did take Silva Mehta and Joseph Campbell, you would come up with a T.S. Little if you put the two of them together.
Yeah, that's right. Well, of course, we all have our, such a large karmic tree, don't we? And mine goes back actually to my grandfather, who was a Presbyterian minister, and actually my great grandfather was a minister as well. So, I'm cut from that cloth, but we each kind of find, don't we? We each find a way to manifest the proclivities or the influences or the imagination that we're handed as young people, and so I'm continuing to kind of roll out, I think, my own karma, in the Christian theology, but of course I'm deeply wedded to Eastern practices.
Yeah, and in fact, you did an undergraduate in Buddhist psychology, was it, with Robert Thurman?
Yeah, I've studied with Bob Thurman. We called him Buddha Bob at the time. And, when I studied, Tibetan psychology
Wow.
with him, and but later on went on to study, in the Dzogchen, in the Tibetan Buddhism, in the Vajrayana teachings. The Dzogchen teachings are very powerful, and so yeah, I mean the Tibetans are very, 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 very clear in their elucidations of the mind and the heart and I appreciate that alongside, so much of the yogic philosophy that, I've had good fortune to study over the years.
I'm interested. So you were practicing Iyengar yoga for some time, and then I guess in the 80s, you just sort of slid to the dark side and decided to go to Mysore, which is such an interesting choice to make.
Right. Well, I was restless. I think as a 20 something, like Bruce Springsteen style, I was always kind of, roaming and so, I think a lot of the athletic style of yoga was really enticing for me. But I was also a competitive 20-year-old, and that, kind of practice, I think, matched that underlying sense of competition and certainly comparing mind. And so I've had to really take, a close investigative look over, the years at what was driving me, what was motivating me to learn all these postural forms and identify with a person, within those forms. But yeah, certainly doing vinyasa yoga, this was, 30 years ago, was very much of an allure for me.
That's so interesting because we do in our workshops together, sometimes we'll do a context and history of Ashtanga yoga. And I'll often put a slide up of Jane Fonda. And I had read in an interview with you that you had mentioned how aerobics kind of led culturally towards, say, a zeitgeist of people doing yoga in a competitive public environment, which is very, very far away from like a Himalayan cave, for example. And it did seem like without that aerobics and without that kind of go, go, go 80s competitive, we may not have the kind of yoga culture that we have today.
Well, I think that there's truth to that, that people identify, with their yoga as a kind of workout and that's important because we all have a lot of places where we, conceal and hold both psychically and emotionally. So really good to have some kind of discipline to, churn through, churn through a lot of that internal history. And but I think as we age, I always say, that yoga does get better as we get older. It's like having, a good bottle of French wine around. The longer you have it, the more ripe it becomes. And certainly that's my experience. At the age of 61 now, and I think I went to Mysore when I was 21. So, um, and I'm willing to be still. I'm not as restless as I was. I guess I've, for those of you who know the words Vata and Pitta, I've been able to sort of tame the lion of the Vata Pitta side to me. It was a good 30-year project, all of that fire. And now, I think my blaze has come to a kind of steady simmer. And I appreciate that because, for those of us who have strong fire, it can be very hard to manage those flames, and they can singe not only the people around us, but also ourselves. So yeah, the movement at one point was really valuable. And not that I don't move now, but I'm careful because I have, joints that are, delicate, or at least they're been compromised by, long years of athletics and yoga.
I wanted to ask you, in 1989, I wondered if you'd kind of come across my first yoga teacher, Sudha Weixler, in Mysore.
Well, I knew Suda from Chicago Day. He
Yeah,
hosted me teaching. He was in North Chicago in Evanston, I believe.
yeah.
And I went to his center maybe once or twice. Lovely chap. And yeah, had a chance to work with his Sangha. So that's right. I know Suda going back, several decades.
I just didn't know if you had rubbed elbows with him in Mysore, because maybe you'd been there at the same time together. But he was an very interesting and very inspiring person for me as a young man, wanting to know what kind of adult I should be. As an 18-year-old, as a freshman in college in Chicago, I was like, I think I want to be Sudha Weixler. I think that's a kind of a person to aspire to.
Mm.
And he's an extremely quiet Austrian celibate. And then I think 30 years later, he had bought a Porsche and had a girlfriend. And I was like, that's a nice arc for a life, I think.
Well, I mean, I relate to that on two levels. I mean, one is that we all need mentors. I think we
Mhm.
all find an individual, maybe it's within our immediate field, or some other place where we have this insight, like, oh my goodness, I can be more than just my small self, and I think especially for men need those kind of guides when men don't get them. I think
Mhm.
we wander around and then oftentimes rely on women for satisfaction. So it is oftentimes the guru tradition, of course, is the underpinning of yoga, and so that male inspiration in many ways was Richard Freeman for me. It was Richard who, I think really spoke from the poetical language that I'm very much drawn to in my own teaching now. And certainly I think when it comes to celibacy and not having a girlfriend, I mean, I think we all start, feeling like we need to really kind of hold a very narrow margins to our practice, and I think there's kind of an excess there can be of discipline and obedience to what we think is tradition, and then over time I think that loosens, and that's important because we can sort of tap into another side of ourselves. I know I found myself, I think, in my early years thinking I had to be a certain way as a male yogi, and when that loosened, there was a texture and color, a color within me that was allowed to express, and thank goodness, looking back now.
I'm curious. I have this, I've been thinking about this experience that seems very real for me, but this intense discipline of, something like the Ashtanga yoga practice, or, probably even in the Iyengar tradition, there's like very intensely focused discipline.
Vipassana.
Yeah, or Vipassana, or like these very intense, but more in this bodily sort of like movement, I think, oriented kind of yoga, not so much in the seated practice. You, in a way, like, I feel like you're kind of moving through ranges of motion and like pushing your body to sort of a maximum capacity. And on the one side, it feels like you're doing a lot of purification, and maybe you are, but on the other side, I feel like you're kind of missing the movement of subtle energy in the body. And that when you are maybe moving into a state where you're not like pushing your body so much to these extreme ranges of motion and extreme sensations, and you're doing something a little more gentle or a little more like seated. It doesn't have to be seated, but even just like quite gentle and slowing it down, it lets you kind of experience that movement of subtle energy and subtle sensation more deeply. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that, because I feel like that's something that you're kind of talking about as this progression in deepening the practice into the subtle awareness of energy versus the external sort of showmanship of what your body can do.
Mm. Well, that's well said. I mean, I think really, discipline is kind of a two-edged sword. I mean, for those who don't have it, it's really good to pick up that blade and sharpen it, and have enough rigor to sustain themselves, through what I like to think of as this, big archaeological dig. We go through layers and layers and layers of self, and not just the fascia and the organ and the bone, but layers and layers of the psyche. So discipline is necessary, but then it can also become its own. One can become enslaved to their own discipline. Think of the triathlete who can't let up. And so at one point I kind of turned that lantern around and looked directly at the one in me inside who was so driven, like, what's driving me? Where am I going? And who's the driver? And those are important questions to ask. Certainly when it comes to rigor and doing, doing strong movements, whether it's yoga or, one's a competitive swimmer or runner, that it's at some point, I think, yeah, when we slow down and we really notice the subtle, the nuance of movement, and being in the soma. I mean, being embodied is such a beautiful thing. It's oftentimes just a brush of breath against, the inner edge of my jaw, or at the back of my cranium, or down my spine. Just that nuance that I think really brings in the body of delight. I found, when I was pushing in the days, when I was using my striver a lot, it was like a horse that was just galloping and wouldn't let up. So now I do move much slower, much more carefully, and yeah, that God is in the details. The nuance of movement is really a source of great joy.
Mm, yeah.
I have a question, and I think I might be risking ridicule by asking this. I'm not sure, but I'm just reminded that Andy Warhol said that we were in the future we would all be famous for 15 minutes, and I feel like we're living that in the present now. That's where we are, and I think it's such a seductive trap that we're all sort of adjacent to. Is like, how could I need to have this conversation, then make sure that I'm dialed into my Instagram to make sure that I can benefit from you know a perfect, a perfect conversation that maybe doesn't need to be broadcast and recorded, but is it maybe interesting? And so within that context, I'm wondering, because I think I was a teenager when I first heard of you, Tias. I think you've been famous for as long as I've been doing yoga. And I wonder about that, what that transition was like for you, that you went from going and living in Mysore and studying with Patabi Joyce for 6 months, which must have been horrific. Though I have to say, I wish I had done it in the 80s. Um, and then now you're in magazines. Like, how did that happen, and how do you balance your state of mind?
Well, that's a really interesting point. Of course, Andy Warhol championed excess, right? You just think of all those, tomato soup cans and
Mhm.
everything's reproducing everything else. And now, we're in this kind of hall of mirrors in the age of the internet and the Instagram and TikTok. And so, I mean, that of course is just such a great, parade of what the yogis have known for millennia as Maya.
Mhm.
And so, I'm part of that, on the one hand, but then I also kind of keep my third eye open and just realize that that it is a kind of on an ongoing display or lila. You might know that word. Some of you in Sanskrit, of course, is play, and so that's important. And on the other hand, one's identity is never fixed, is it? Right? One's sense of self is never solid, and it's always being well, maybe now in the age of AI more than ever, it's being re packaged and reformatted and reconfigured. And so I try to kind of live that, not easy to do. And in my long journey of unselfing, which I do think to some extent, on the one hand, yoga involves a kind of, dismantling of one's own solid self. I try to sort of walk that line, having a kind of, some, notoriety. But I'll tell you really, is that I'm really profoundly an introvert, and I really cherish, that when I turn my lantern inside, it's that's the wellspring from which I'm able to be in the world, and I don't know, I know some of you may listening, be introvert yourself, and that's the sanctum. It's in that temple that I think we find our rasa. We find our most authentic self. And so, I try to tap into that sanctum every day, and so I don't get caught in this hall of mirrors, as some perhaps do.
Gosh, I really feel that remark. It's we're both kind of introvert extroverts, where
Yeah.
we present a lot of energy for a public in a workshop setting, say, or in one of these broadcasts, and then we both have to kind of hide away to kind of recover, and it takes some doing for us to be pulled out of our little
Cocoon.
caves, little igloo,
Cocoon, but igloo
cocoon,
works too.
igloo, cave, all these wonderful things. I've never, and you mentioned this on a podcast I was listening to this morning, like the that I'm going to paraphrase. I'm not sure I'm saying it right, but you'd said something like people need to be um, encouraged to find that introversion, and they don't maybe necessarily have an outlet for it as much as they should. Is that maybe what you said? I'm not sure.
I think that's right. We do live in such a sort of talk show host culture. Even the Dharma, the mindfulness movement
Right.
is not immune to this, and so we don't really cherish that time where we cocoon inside. I think we all need to conceal. I think that's really important. The hidden, the concealment, the cocooning, and then we also need exposure. We also need to be revealed. I mean, consider a dream, right? You have a dream where you might be exposed. You're naked. I mean, who hasn't had a dream where they're exposed naked? I think that's such an archetypal experience in a dream. But on the other hand, you have a dream where you stay in the closet or you duck behind the couch or you don't want to be seen. And so the psyche has both sides, the revelatory and the conceal. And I think, it's good. Maybe
Yeah.
go back and forth between the two. It's not like we have to take sides. And so in that sense, I think, there's a solar lunar, there's a introvert, extrovert, I think male, female. It's to each of us that needs to be celebrated.
So nice. I think to my mother's confusion, or perhaps she often found me tucked away and hidden in a box or a closet, which fans of the show often suspect that I am in the closet, but um it was my favorite place to be as a child, was just to be hidden in a little box. But there's also this, yeah, we do also want to be celebrated, and that's it's that involves a vulnerability.
Right. It does. I mean, that nakedness, of course, the quintessential vulnerability. But I think, yeah, those when we're in our private conversations and we can, commune with our own reflection and our own hopes and fears. I mean, that's, back to the notion of subtle body, which of course is always interesting for me. It's like, what happens there? Do I am I simply, retreating from the world? Is there an edge of melancholy? What kind of, fears come up? And then, how can I move through that tunnel? And then, trust myself to be in the world and and um, and have the courage, to be leaning forward into whatever might arise. So I think it is. I think at some point it's all about listening, and I think it's hard to listen when you're in the din and the cacophony of voices. Sometimes I'm listening to a podcast and I'm just like, this voice and this conversation, it's just, like the
Too
teacher,
much.
Charlie Brown,
Mm-hmm.
that
Wah,
wow,
wah,
wow.
wah.
It's really not serving me to really, touch back into that place inside of me. So I shut it off. And then, because I like to have that as my template. Not everyone knows, I think, inside of them the template of their authentic self. There's a lot of groping and searching. I think that it does go on before we find that place. But once we know it, then you want to come back home
Mm-hmm.
to that. There's a belonging. I feel, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's beautiful. When I hear you speak about the subtle body, I think it's a concept that maybe eludes a lot of practitioners, a lot of people in general, but obviously practitioners would be more aware of it than just, regular people walking around. You speak of it though, not just like in the terms of nadis or prana or chakras, but there's a lot of emotional layers and psychological layers embedded in how you're speaking about tapping into the subtle body. Can you explain maybe a little bit more about like what we're doing as yoga practitioners and how the subtle body and our physical body and our emotional body and our mental body all are interconnected?
Yeah, no, that's really important, Harmony. It's like, oh, in that just that very fine wisp of breath or nerve pulsation, right? What's an arterial pulse like? What's an arterial pulse like? Like where's your blood pressure right now? Like, are you low blood pressure, or is your blood pressure elevating, And so when we have the skills or the tools to be able to attune to that kind of physiological nuance, it's really, I think they're valuable skills, and that requires the listening. And then, when it comes to thoughts, I mean, thoughts affect heart rate, thoughts affect digestion, thoughts affect your dreams, thoughts affect your immune system. So then we tune to those memories, those vasana, those sanskara, those traces of memory, wisps of memory, and so I think the process in our archaeological dig, I think at first we basically get out our pickaxe and you get out your shovel. I mean, I've seen people, get out their dynamite sticks and you just kind of like, and then, after some time, we get out our brush. You've got that very fine, little and your little picks, and you can't like plow in anymore because the nervous system is so delicate. We're like lizards. We pick up vibration so readily. The birds, the liver, the lizards, the fish. And so when we become more sentient, when we become more sensitive, when we attune in that way, we know that what's needed is that fine brush, you know. And so I think, maybe that's a little bit of a poetic way of describing subtle body. I mean, there's the chakras and then the internal winds, and it gets mapped out beautifully and rather mysteriously in the yogic tradition. But yeah, I try to attend to that inside of myself, and the more rarefied or the more subtle we become, like the 18th century poets in Britain, there's that sense of just how the light reflecting in the tree or the way the wind moves on water, it moves the spirit, and so we're moved by just the small things in life, and that little tingle, goes up your spine when you're watching a movie, and you feel that empathetic flow inside. And so we treasure that. We want to like allow that to express itself.
That's really fascinating and really well articulated. And I had the misfortune, which turned into be an extraordinary gift of an intense period of isolation as a young person. I went to South Korea to teach English, not realizing that no one spoke English, and so outside of my classes, I had nothing to do, and at that time, in there was nothing to read because there was no internet and very few books. So all I really had was going for walks in nature, and it became a kind of extraordinary period of time. It was not unlike doing Vipassana, but for like 9 months. And it was shocking. But I think at the end of that time, I realized just exactly how you described that I needn't never feel bored again. I could just always just feel it. And if I had to be someplace, I could just look at things like the floor and I'd be fine. I wouldn't need to be stimulated. And I hadn't kind of realized that this was a kind of actual practice until I had done Vipassana. And it's like, and then it very immediately came roaring back in that space. It's like, oh yeah, they've designed this whole thing to make this happen.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, just taking that walk in the woods and being in that space of time where there is a rich aloneness, like there can be a rich aloneness. I mean, sometimes the aloneness is off-putting, or we have a sense of a scarcity. But if there can be a sense of ripening of one's aloneness, I think, yeah, in the sensorium, we do develop this colorful and very rich fabric of being, and that I think is a source of the body of delight. I think the meditators, point to that. And so in yoga, it's not about cutting off from the senses or the sensorium, but really, in a sense, heightening our perceptivity, our capacity to perceive. And I always like to watch people. I still do, and I think we're losing the art of. Many of us are of people watching. I was in the airport just 2 weeks ago, and I really, to be honest, 60 to 70% of the people had their heads down in their screen,
Mm-hmm.
and I just love watching people. And there's a kind of joy in the observer. So when we kind of heighten our capacity to perceive, not only inwardly what's happening inside my heart and my gut and my emotion and my memories as a child, but also the world around me. I think it does, it brings us outside of ourselves and makes for a very rich experience. So it sounds like, your experience in South Korea was very much like that.
Very much so. It gives me a kind of sense of concern when I see young people who have a deep anxiety about being bored. And I've seen it in our child that, if he doesn't have a way to entertain himself, you can sort of see like the panic kind of overwhelm him. It's like, you can just be bored. It's very nice. It's not the worst thing. It's, I think, the best thing.
Well, that's right. And at some point in our practice, we have to, to practice non-doing.
Mhm.
What I like to think of as a shavasana, or a meditation, where we're sort of present and absent at the same time. That is, we're not doing anything, we're not trying to get anywhere or accomplish anything, but we're also kind of present in that place of rest. And I mean, all of my classes, those of you who take from me will know, we begin in Shavasana, and Shavasana is the thread between every movement. And this celebrates what's known in the early Taoist teachings as Wu Wei, Wei. Wu Wei in the Chinese tradition is the non manipulating, not trying to fix, not trying to make better, but just being. And then that's in that place. There is a real richness there. But you're right. We're so restless. We're born to run. We're always feeling like we've got to do something else, and the gadgets are take advantage of that. And so learning to pare everything down and be with the simple, inhale and exhale, or the sound of the wind in the gutter on your roof, or the light as it's reflected in the trees, or, just being with your sleepiness, that's a kind of maturity in the practice. So, yeah. And how as teachers we impart that to people, That, of course, is not easy. How do you teach this? But we try.
Yeah, I think it's a deep vibration within you that gets transmitted beyond words when you have that like calmness, or that it's not even a calmness, it's just a complete
Presence.
acceptance of whatever is arising in the moment. Yeah, an acceptance, a total like ability to just surrender to what is. I do think it is a non-celebrated skill that is highly desirable, because it's so it's the remedy. It's like the medicine to everything that our society, our culture, our tendencies, our samskaras are kind of pushing us always out of balance. And it's kind of the only medicine or remedy to bring us back into ourselves in the present moment, I think. And what you're saying is beautiful. The non-doing, the woo way of cultivating that inside of ourselves is so critical.
Yeah, and I really like to use poetical language, descriptive language. I mean, partly it's because I was an English major, and plus I just have an affinity for the turn of a phrase. And so I wanted to share, if I can, a poem that I wrote recently. I
Oh,
have a collection
yeah.
that just came out. It's called "In the Space Between."
Oh,
Oh,
beautiful.
fantastic.
Is the name of
The the
yeah, this.
poetry of embodiment. That's a book of poems.
Right, right. Yeah,
Oh,
they're designed, to be read in the Dharma room, the meditation hall, or in the yoga studio, in Shavasana. Uh,
Beautiful.
and so if I can, I'll share this one.
Please.
It's called Sanctify the Space Within.
Mm.
Sanctify the space within. Just as the smoke of incense stick dissolves into space, let thoughts swirl, drift, and evaporate. Let yourself be fanned by the winds of breath, the winds of time. The Buddha taught all that arises ceases. The Buddha taught all that arises ceases. Let everything come to rest. Let everything come to rest. Let the white ash of your old self drop to the ground like the bones of the body of Christ, wafer like and fine. Take the remains from the fire, smear your skin, sanctify the space within.
Mm.
that's lovely.
And of course, I was thinking of Shavasana, right? Like just as the smoke from an incense stick dissolves into space, like that smoke, just kind of like where the material becomes like just nothing, let thoughts swirl and drift and evaporate. Let yourself be fanned by the winds of breath, the winds of time. And then this phrase came to me. I did this whole course of study in my days sitting vipassana, and this phrase, my teacher said, well, there's really only four words that Buddha taught. All that arises ceases. All that arises ceases. And so then let everything come to rest. Let the white ash of your old self drop to the ground. Like that's that shavasana. Let that white ash of your old self drop to the ground, like the bones of the body of Christ, wafer like and fine. That's that subtle body thing, like just like the wafer, very fine. Take the remains from the fire, smear your skin, sanctify the spaces within. And I always remember Patabi Joyce, when I was in Mysore, he would always take, the ash, on his
Mm.
forehead, at 5:30 a.m. And in the Shiva tradition, there's a purification of the brain, and the cortex through that direct touch of the ash, as there is, of course, in the Christian tradition. And so, yeah, that just came to me. This sanctify the space within, this little poem.
It's beautiful. You have such a beautiful way of weaving together all of these religious traditions and mystical kind of practices from all the different religious traditions, and using um, the metaphor and the similarities to paint or
Yeah,
describe,
paint.
paint with words.
Mm.
A beautiful, beautiful image. Thank you so much for sharing that.
I'd love if you would share another one. I just had a, a a fanboy question. When you were there 6 months in Mysore, and who else was there with you at the time? It wasn't just you, was it? Or was Richard there?
Yes, so that was the time of Dina Kinsberg from
Oh
Australia,
yeah.
um, Derek and Rada, a
Oh,
couple of
wow. Was he
from
wearing weights when he was practicing?
yeah, rugby. Eric was a amazing yogi. This looked like Tarzan, right? This like massive,
Yeah.
robust build, ex-rugby player, um,
Right.
who died of cancer tragically. What was that, 10, 20, 15 years ago?
Oh,
Um,
1990?
yeah,
19,
yeah,
2000 he died?
2000 was it?
Yeah.
Chuck and Mati, Mati and Chuck, who ran Yoga Works in
Mm.
California, really, the real taproot of, a lot of yoga in North
Mhm.
America was coming out of Santa Monica. Eddie Modestini,
Oh, Eddie, yeah.
yes. So yeah, really, John Scott.
Oh,
John Scott was a very dear, the Kiwi, very dear colleague of mine at the
The
time. I think he's
the
still going.
graphic designer.
Yeah, yeah, right.
He wouldn't call himself that now, but that's probably what he was at the time. I'm a graphic
Mhm.
designer doing yoga.
Amazing man, amazing.
Yeah.
Each of us has our own path, don't we? And so,
yeah.
whichever thread, you follow. And
Hmm.
for me, since I've always had a real proclivity towards the dream. I do a lot of dream work, and towards really investigating, like, what is it that makes me want to do the yoga, like who's the doer behind these forms. I just keep unpacking, and it's like, what is it, like that Chinese, those dolls. We just keep unpacking and packing and packing. And it wasn't until I really came into the Mahayana, really the Zen teachings, show that once you've kind of unpacked as far as you possibly can unpack, then what are you left with? What's there? And that's where we come into the plane of, what's called that pervading awareness, or that
Mm,
unconditional awareness, or the awareness that has no bounds, that sky mind. It's not male or female, it's not black or white, it's not Shiite or Sunni, it's not gay or straight, old or young. It's really that, it's that that we yoke to. And so, but it is this unpacking, isn't it? Just layer by layer by layer. So I think it's important because it takes time, because sometimes I'll get to like that doll, like that fourth or fifth doll in, and it just won't really move, because my sense of T.S. Little got so like marbled, kind of like granite, maybe granite marble. It got so solidified there. And so then it takes a couple of years to kind of move that
Hmm.
one doll. And then you just, yeah, until, you experience what they call shunyata, of course, profoundly in Zen and Mahayana, is there's just spaciousness. There's just, pure space. So, you're there in Calgary. We're here in Santa Fe. You could be in Manhattan or over Seoul, South Korea. It's the same space, same space. It's not
Hmm.
limited by, like, zip code, or your county line, or certainly your country divide. And we're so preoccupied with our country's bare boundaries, and
mm.
with the crisis around the immigrants, um, and uh, and this kind of thing. So with yogis, of course, know that mind heart is essentially boundless.
Hmm.
Yeah, I love that. The mind heart,
But that's
where we really exist.
I know that you said that you had to go soon, but I wonder if you would read one more selection from your book in the space between.
Oh, thank you so much. Let's see. Yeah, this one's
Mm.
entitled simply "In the Space Between,"
Oh.
and it goes like this: At long last, I've come back to myself. So that's the first line. That's the first line. At long last, I've come back to myself. After years of wandering down vacant hallways, up back stairwells, and across stretches of lonely highway. I've scrolled through endless pages, sending and receiving, caught in a web of searching. I've been tossed to and fro between gain and loss, love and hate, hope and despair. Now I return to the seemingly simplest thing. Now I return to the seemingly simplest thing, sitting upright, not moving a muscle, letting my breath breathe me. This goes against every urge, every impulse I've ever known. All my ploys, my desire to please you, to appear witty and charming, to convince you of my significance, to get one up on the world, are now for naught. Helpless, I drop the weighty load of me. Helpless, I drop the weighty load of me and sit bare naked before the great silence. Tender-hearted, I settle into the space between breaths where joy and sorrow meet. So that's it. In the space between, ultimately between breath, of course, between inhale and exhale, maybe between your right body and your left body, between your lungs, between, your day and the night, that dusk or that dawn, that's a beautiful place. And so for me, it was like, after striving, like I've wandered around, I've been looking and looking and looking, and then I come back to the very simplest thing, just sitting, breathing, and then I have to sort of drop that weighty load of me. And it's like a big rucksack, so heavy. You carry it around town with you. It's like, oh my God, my shoulders. And then you just sit bare naked. It's like, oh, just, tender hearted. You settle into the space between where joy and sorrow meet. And I think that's where we are today. I do think like we all experience joy. We do. That's important, the joy. But we all experience sorrow. I mean, if you don't experience sorrow today, I'm going to worry a little bit, like, are you okay? Like, what's wrong with you? Because this is a tough time. I mean, it really is. Wars and famine and fires and, hurricanes. So it's like we're sitting with the joy and the sorrow. Anyhow, this poem came to me and just, I'm glad to share with you.
Oh, thank you. So beautiful.
You really have a kind of it's Robert Frost. You've kind of got there's a New England texture there.
Oh, thank you so much. That's an honor. Yeah. Well, he spent time in the woods, right? Like
That's right.
the paths,
Where
paths.
two paths divide.
Take
Right.
the path less traveled by.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, gee, it's been a great to, have my path lead right to you. So thank you so much for inviting me in.
Yeah, it's been our pleasure. And you have a course through Shambhala Publications that's coming up, and I think there's a free training being offered.
Yoga of the
starting
subtle
today,
body.
Yoga of the Subtle Body,
Starting today.
named after your
Book.
your book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yoga of the Subtle Body. Yeah, it's an online course, really detailing the chakras and the breathing and, as I've been suggesting, the connection to the breath and the nerves and the bone. And so it'll be experiential, but it'll also be a time for reflection and consideration. But yeah, it's called Yoga of the Subtle Body.
Beautiful. And there's a few live classes with you as well, I think, isn't there?
Yes, there are. There are.
Yeah, wonderful. So if listeners want to really go into the subtle body and explore from the inside, the spaces between, they can join your course and get your books. There's 5 of them.
We're just so honored you came on the show. This is a spectacular day for us. Thank you.
And they could come visit you in Santa Fe as well, right?
Please do sometime. That would be an honor to have you come visit. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be such a blessing. So thank you so much for coming on today. It was really, truly a blessing for us.
Okay, thank you. Okay, be well. Mangalam.
Thank you. Mangalam.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, I hope you loved that conversation. I mean, T.S. Little is such a gifted teacher, interweaving metaphor and imagination into how he teaches using such beautiful poetic language, and just truly embodies this ancient wisdom and the subtle awareness of energy and breath and physicality into who he is and how he is in the world. I loved that we got to dive into his connection to Buddhism, as well as his studies with Iyengar and living in Mysore back in the 80s, studying Ashtanga. And, such a beautiful, rich conversation. So be sure that you take this opportunity to get into his free training on the subtle body. It's open to everyone. It's only open for this week. Check out the link in the bio. And, he's already authored 5 books. One is called Yoga of the Subtle Body. There's The Thread of Breath, Meditations on a Dewdrop, Practices the Path, and In the Space Between, The Poetry of Embodiment. He's just such a rich human being with so much depth. So learning from him will only help to elevate your practice to new levels and help you go deeper into yourself and the experience of that subtle body awareness. So get into his course, just do it. And I look forward to connecting with you next week on the Finding Harmony podcast. That's it. We've concluded another episode of the Finding Harmony podcast. I just want to thank you so much for doing the work that changes the world, starting with yourself. It truly does make a huge difference. Please make sure you have your automatic downloads turned on wherever you listen so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. I have so much more magic I can't wait to share with you. Lastly, if you're on Instagram, I love connecting and hearing from you. So come on over and say hello at Finding Harmony Podcast. And you can also come say hello to me personally at Harmony Slater Official. Thank you again for being here. I cannot wait to share more with you in our next episode.